Battlefield is one of the most successful, beloved franchise of shooters in history. But there is no doubting Battlefield's road has been a rocky one, and with a new one on the horizon, I wanted to talk about the franchise as a whole, what lessons they must learn from their previous installments, and whether or not an abandoned game mode could help revive this and put it squarely in the crosshairs of Call of Duty once again. Much like football rivalries, the gaming rivalries that exist today are far less heated than they were 10 to 20 years ago. The console wars is something many of us will remember, where you were either Team Sony or Team Microsoft, and depending on which side of the divide you planted your flag, you were mocked, criticised, and even ostracised from your friendship group. Exclusives meant exactly what they said on the tin. Crossplay was but a field dream, and you had to deal with not being able to play with your friends if you had the wrong console. This meant you often had to choose between playing Gran Turismo or Forza. Final Fantasy or Fable are just two examples where the games you wanted to play would dictate the console that you owned. We likely all experienced scenarios where, if like me, you only owned one of the two consoles, you therefore relied on friends if you wanted to experience games on the other side of the fence. Then there were the games that crossed the console divide, where the conversation was purely about hardware and not the game. FIFA vs Pro Evolution Soccer, for example, was a big one for me growing up. Being available on both consoles, it meant I had the freedom to pick not only what game I wanted to play, but what console I wanted to play it on. Then we come to one of the biggest rivalries in gaming, Battlefield versus Call of Duty. Whilst it is fair to say that the rivalry in 2024 is nowhere near that which it was many years ago, like FIFA versus Pro Evo, you made a decision on which you played, and in those days there was almost this unspoken level of loyalty to the brand, which meant that even in the face of factual, clear indications that one was more popular than the other or one was better than the other, you rarely swayed from your chosen franchise. Now, as the title suggests, this is a video about all things Battlefield, but it would be remiss of me to ignore the part that Call of Duty played during its 22-year lifespan. Now, I'm going to let you all into a little secret. I have, for the most part, been a huge Battlefield fan, far preferring the big, large-scale warfare craziness over the kind of smaller in scale, quick movement, fast action style of Call of Duty. However, due to my reluctance to get into online gaming and preference of narrative-driven single-player experiences, Call of Duty's first few installments was actually my first foray into either of these two franchises. It also helped that World War II is my favourite time period from history. I am just fascinated by the heroic stories of the brave men and women who fought on both sides of the conflict, so the fact that the early CODs were based in World War II meant it was a very big draw for me. So in those early to mid-2000s, Call of Duty was for me the only real option. Although I would also like to point out that while we're talking about rivalries, there was also a couple of other franchises around at the time aiming to take their own slice of the FPS pie. There was Medal of Honor, which released several iconic and memorable games such as Allied Assault and Frontline. We also had Brothers in Arms Road to Hill 30, which to this day is considered by many to be one of, if not the best World War II games ever made. Sadly, both franchises are all but gone and are just distant memories of a time where we were just swamped with fantastic shooters from brilliant development teams. Like the aforementioned games, Battlefield 2 started out in that World War II bucket with its first entry titled Battlefield 1942. Whilst it did not have a single-player campaign like its competitors, what it did do was lay the foundation for what would become the style and tone for practically every Battlefield game released to this day. Right from the outset, in its very first entry, Battlefield was always about large, open maps with vehicular warfare. It boasted a class system which promoted teamwork and collaborative gameplay by forcing players to play a certain way depending on their chosen class. You could fly various World War II fighters and bombers, navigate capital ships, subs, aircraft carriers. You could man coastal artillery defences, drive tanks, drive APCs and jeeps, and all of this was so unique at the time that it was unsurprising that the game was incredibly popular with gamers. Now, this all may sound pretty run-of-the-mill now, as we have seen this formula not only in the Battlefield sequels but in other games as well, but in 2002 when this released, it was innovative, it was incredibly fun, and importantly, it was a commercial success, with over 3 million copies sold within the first 2 years of release. It was an important moment for Battlefield. Hitting a home run right out of the gate cemented its place for years to come and giving it a real shot at longevity. Looking back now, could this have been the birth of multiplayer gaming for FPS? That in an era of single-player campaign-focused games, a multiplayer-only experience was commercially viable. Next up was Battlefield Vietnam, another commercial success that focused on the groundwork laid made by 1942. Continuing with the multiplayer-only approach, it sported two headline improvements, a 3D map and a vehicle radio system which would play music from the 60s. But if that didn't tickle your fancy, you could also import your own. The game also features a sippy hole as a mobile spawn point, which is representative of the vast tunnel networks utilised by the Vietnam forces. It also stands out in the history of FPS games as being a very rare venture into this time period. The Vietnam conflict is a heavily underused theatre of war in gaming, and to this day, Viet Cong is the only other attempt at taking FPS gaming into this era that I can think of. Outside of that, it was a familiar feel, as DICE did the right thing and focused on what worked in their previous games and built upon it. Battlefield 2 then came along, and this was really where I finally stood up and took notice. I was 16 when this game came out, and still up to that point, I was very much still on the Call of Duty and Medal of Honor train. Even so far as to have LAN parties with friends where we played games of COD 2 in the multiplayer mode. Still enjoying the single player aspects more than those online experiences, I was still really reluctant to switch. But the lure of Battlefield was starting to become difficult to ignore. But in an act of defiance, I remained resolute in my opinion that multiplayer gaming online with random people was just not for me. Despite my reluctance to switch, those that were playing were having a blast. The third iteration of this franchise improved across the board. A new game engine that improved the physics, the lighting, bullet penetration, and with new gameplay features being added specifically to complement the existing class system, teamwork and collaboration was as important in Battlefield as it had ever been. GameSpot hit the nail on the head in their review. They said, "When you experience Battlefield 2 like it's meant to be played, with everyone working together and using real-time voice chat, the game quickly becomes unlike anything else you've played before." That being said, many outlets did report that the PC requirements might be a barrier to players, as it needed quite the machine to play it. Despite this slight obstacle that may have prevented some players from playing, the game sold over 1 million units in its first month of release. At this point, it was undeniable that Battlefield was here to stay, and it was difficult to argue that it wasn't sitting on top of the throne of FPS shooters. The first foray into the console playing field was Battlefield 2 Modern Combat, hitting the shelves in 2005, a few months after Battlefield 2 released. It was the first to offer a single-player campaign, and it was reasonably well received. But make no mistake, Battlefield was a PC game first and foremost, despite this testing of the waters release. But Call of Duty, who had by this time embarked on a journey that would see them release a game every year from 2005 until the present day, was cooking up a storm of their own that would mark the beginning of a beautiful rivalry. Battlefield 2 continued to enjoy success well into 2006, but in 2007, things shifted dramatically with the release of Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare. The single-player campaign was still there like it had been in previous games, and it was absolutely fantastic. But now, they had gone in head first into the multiplayer space with a fully fledged online experience. Little did we know, this was the start of what would become the biggest money-spinning juggernaut in gaming history. Just as Battlefield had done in their last entry, they moved to a modern-day setting, and it remains to this day one of the best Call of Duties ever released, and it struck a chord with players. There was now a big rival to Battlefield in the online space, even if the experiences were vastly different. Players now could play Battlefield if they wanted big battles, vehicular fights, capturing points in a collaborative way, or they could now play COD if they wanted a smaller map, intense, fast action-paced gunfights that relied on instincts, reactions, as well as skill to succeed. A ranking system that encouraged you to grind, abilities to call in, and the legendary in-game chat, which yielded some hilarious clips over the years. One of the big differences between the two was the fact that you could play a round of COD in 5 to 10 minutes, hop in and hop out at will. Battlefield's time demands were much higher, and this was likely a huge deciding factor during the process of which game a player would choose. It won numerous Game of the Year titles and even got 2 BAFTA Video Game Awards. It was the top-selling game worldwide in 2007, selling around 7 million copies by January 2008, and it continued to sell all the way up to nearly 16 million copies by 2013. Call of Duty had well and truly landed. The longevity and popularity of that game is astounding when you take into account that those numbers continue to rise at those levels despite a new COD being released every single year. Battlefield didn't have a game in 2007, releasing the year previously with Battlefield 2142. Switching up to a more futuristic setting, and for the 4th PC game in a row choosing to resist the temptation at throwing in a single-player campaign, it once again focused on what has worked for them up to this point. One could argue if a "it ain't broke, don't fix it" type approach was the right thing, but that's certainly what they went for. Unfortunately, the sales were very disappointing. Reviews-wise, it was reasonable, perhaps not up to the heights of its predecessors, but certainly not enough to justify the huge drop in sales. Reportedly, just 220,000 units were sold, which is a real far cry from the 3 million units of the previous game, Battlefield 2. Was this the first significant indication in a real shift in the market? A sign that COD had come in and barged into the conversation and taken over. Call of Duty's dominance in this space was already looking likely with Modern Warfare, but World at War pretty much secured it. We had the first iteration of zombies, we had a campaign, we had the multiplayer that everyone had fallen in love with. Even though most agreed that Modern Warfare was better, the game still sold 15.7 million units up to November 2013. This attitude and outlook on the franchise's future releases would replay itself over and over again, with different development studios taking turns in releasing games, allowing them to maintain that yearly schedule. It almost didn't matter which game was better, it would just forever be a commercial success. An almost crazy level of FOMO had developed. Fans couldn't bear to be left behind. Kids didn't want to be the ones stuck on last year's Call of Duty, so even if they eventually went back to 2007's Modern Warfare, for example, that didn't mean they weren't still buying the yearly releases as we do today. 2009's Modern Warfare 2 and 2010's Black Ops further cemented their status as the top of the tree. But this doesn't mean that Battlefield standards dropped. In 2008, a defining entry in the series dropped on console, Battlefield Bad Company. This was a huge deviation and a very obvious reaction to the success of COD. No PC release was a very interesting decision, one which risked alienating practically their entire player base, which up to now had been almost exclusively PC based outside of the one Battlefield 2 Modern Combat release. But there was plenty here for Battlefield fans to get excited about. The campaign was hilarious with great likeable characters, and the multiplayer was fantastic. This represented the first entry into multiplayer gaming for me, and to this day, pretty much the only FPS I've ever actually played on console to any great length. It was very chaotic and action-packed, quite different from what we had seen in the PC releases. The game mode that came at release, called Rush, forced more action-orientated gameplay by focusing the entire 24-player lobby into two objectives on the map in an attack versus defense style mode. This meant that getting in and out of the action was far quicker than we'd seen in Conquest, that was the mainstay of the series up to now, so it lent itself a little more into that COD formula, in what to me at least was an obvious attempt at enticing some players to jump over the fence. It showed that Battlefield truly wanted to compete with COD, but it ensured that it remained totally at one with its own core values and principles that had made it a success up to this point. Bad Company was a hit with players, and despite some questionable decisions in the lead up to the game regarding weapon unlocks being tied to previous game progression, the game landed well, scoring reasonably high and selling a couple million copies, which taken in isolation, that is a good result, but it was still a drop in the ocean compared to the sort of numbers that Call of Duty was pulling in. We cannot move on from this game without talking about the single biggest addition to the franchise that came in this entry, something that became synonymous with the franchise from this point forward: destruction. Frostbite engine is something that we are all familiar with today, with newer iterations of it appearing in a wide plethora of EA titles. But this was the birthplace. This was Genesis. Frostbite 1.0 made its groundbreaking impact right here, and what it did was change the interpretation of gamers for this franchise. 90% of the objects in this game were available for destruction. The entire map could change in look and feel with a few well-placed tank shells. I will never forget a moment that I experienced with this game where the scale of the destruction really dawned on me properly for the first time. I remember running around a corner, coming face to face with a tank. Quickly realising that the class choice I had at the time meant that there was nothing that I could do to deal with it, I ran into a small shed-type building, foolishly thinking that if I took refuge in there I would be safe, only for the tank to proceed to drive straight through the shed, completely levelling it and turning me into jam in the process. The Frostbite engine was no joke, and to be honest, we haven't really seen any FPS games outside of this franchise really make an attempt at this kind of destruction levels. The fairly recent release game, The Finals, is the only one I can think of, but even then, that is made by Embark Studios, which was founded by ex-Battlefield and DICE devs. So it's kind of a apple not falling too far from the tree type scenario. In 2009, they went back to their roots, and Battlefield 1943 hit the stores, and once again, it shifted a few million units. But still, they could not make any headway into that market share that COD had swallowed up. In 2010, Battlefield entered what is for many its golden era. 4 main titles released back-to-back that the vast majority of players believe were all absolutely brilliant entries, and it began with the sequel to Bad Company, Bad Company 2. Bad Company 2 is probably the game in this entire franchise that I spent most of my time with. playing with work friends almost every night for a huge chunk of time. It came to PC as well as console, a formula that the game would stick to from this point forward, and it meant that I could ditch the controller and get back to my preferred keyboard and mouse. The game sold really well, shifting 6.5 million units, and with an updated 1.5 Frostbite engine, Destruction looked better than ever before. Preston Marlowe returned with his merry men for another fun single-player campaign, so everyone was happy. It played brilliantly, the level of detail in the environments was hugely impressive, and there for me was this real feeling that this was now the pinnacle of Battlefield gaming, especially when you look at the package as a whole. Gunplay was hectic at times, slow at others, and was totally dependent on your playstyle. It looked brilliant, it sounded even better, and there was never a moment's peace when you were fighting over objectives. But meanwhile, COD could just seemingly do no wrong. While Battlefield was searching for the keys to success, making sweeping changes to their gameplay, albeit largely very good ones, COD had found a formula that just didn't need a huge amount of tweaking. Their single-player campaigns were more gritty, dark and intense than that of Battlefield's, despite the fun that I had with them, especially Battlefield 3's campaign. And from a sales point of view, it just felt like a runaway train that was showing no signs of slowing down. 2009's Modern Warfare 2, for example, sold 4.7 million units in the first 24 hours of being on sale. The total revenue from the first day of sales in the US and the UK was $310 million, making Modern Warfare 2 the biggest entertainment launch in history at the time. By January 2010, just 3 months after release, it had taken over $1 billion in sales, 8 million players online within the first 5 days, and 25 million unique players by March of 2010. If you're Battlefield and EA, how on earth do you keep up with those numbers? Thankfully, faced with such unsurmountable odds and a playing field that was so incredibly dominated by COD, it did not deter Battlefield, and they continued on, not allowing their quality to drop. Bad Company 2 was fantastic, but what came next was finally something that really meant that COD fans should take notice. Battlefield 3 and 4 came along and were comfortably two of their biggest and most commercially successful games to date, shifting 17 million and 14.8 million units respectively. We were given a modern day setting, beautiful graphics and an updated Frostbite engine for even more chaos and destruction, which continued to be a massive draw for the series. Levolution, anyone? Well, for those that aren't aware, this term was coined due to the completely and utterly mind-boggling level of map alterations that would come from either a timed or player-triggered event in the game. Fans will never forget the first time they saw the tower in Shanghai drop, or blowing the retaining wall at Lumphney Garden. Over time, perhaps many argued that whilst it was visually stunning, after you'd sort of seen it 50, 100 times, it did lose its wow factor, and perhaps the map altering effects that come with the general destruction is arguably more beneficial to the game than those events that only change the map in very specific ways. For example, the tower in Shanghai would leave a big pile of rubble on the floor, but the rest of the map was the same. Outside of not being able to fight inside the tower anymore, in the end this perhaps served as visual stimulus rather than something that benefited the gameplay all that much. Battlefield, in my opinion, peaked here. This was as good as it got for them. Battlefield 1 and Battlefield 5 were great games, more on those in a minute, but the staying power of Battlefield 3 and 4, even to this day, is a testament to just how good those games were. With an active player base that means you can still jump in and find populated servers, it serves as a reminder that a measure of success can also include a metric of how long your game remains relevant and exciting to play. Battlefield then, to their credit, attempted to deviate from the tried and tested model of either World War II, futuristic or modern day combat, and went for a cops and robbers approach with 2015's Battlefield Hardline. 4 million units sold will tell you that it wasn't a flop, but compared to the numbers of Battlefield 3 and 4, it definitely wasn't a success either. That being said, I do give huge props to them for attempting this. This was a big gamble for them to try something different. Different look, different feel, different game modes, and the vast majority of Battlefield fans would tell you that this game was actually pretty decent and was somewhat underrated at the time. Then Battlefield 1 comes along and added something that I really don't think any game has matched to this degree: immersion. No FPS game that I've ever played has ever matched the immersion of Battlefield 1. The setting in of itself was unprecedented as well. I am racking my brains trying to think of another FPS game that uses this theatre of war, and I can't. Whilst like any game, some maps were horrible, by the time all the DLCs came out, updates to the game had been made, this game had several maps and modes that not only looked fantastic graphically, but really conveyed the utter chaos, horrifying and frankly frightening nature of the Great War. Planes flying over dropping bombs on you, gas grenades, fire, bayonets, huge hulking tanks that lazily manoeuvred their way across the maps, struck fear into soldiers, horses charging at you, huge gun emplacements, armoured trains and huge sprawling zeppelins raining fire from above. Holy crap, this was incredible. I wasn't a massive fan of the gunplay originally, preferring the gunplay of BF5 instead. I actually played considerably more of Battlefield 5 over Battlefield 1, which I am well aware is a controversial take. But having returned to the game recently, I have grown to realise just how amazing this game really is. It is so unique, and if EA want a blueprint of things they need to try and recapture in the next Battlefield game, then they really need to look at Battlefield 1 and attempt to replicate the incredible attention to detail, the levels of authenticity when it comes to immersing the gamer in whatever battlefield you're putting them in. Is it all historically accurate? Pfft, honestly, I've got no idea. I'm not a historian, but frankly, it doesn't matter. It was an absolute masterpiece of game immersion. The soundtrack for this game, as well as the upcoming Battlefield 5, are in my opinion unmatched. The orchestral nature of the menu songs, or the ones that play as you push through the front lines into the next location on the map, were just fantastic. The sounds of the weapons, the dive bombing Stukas, the explosions, the screams of the fallen soldiers. Perfection. Next up, we have Battlefield 5, and this one can probably be best described as a game of two halves. In the first half of the match between this game and Public Opinion, you can trace the worrying signs all the way back to the first reveal of the game. The trailer in particular took a ton of flack. 600,000 dislikes on YouTube, with fans of the game criticising it for a lack of historical accuracy, authenticity, and immersiveness. Complaints were given to the use of certain weapons, prosthetics, and body art as being very uncommon in that time period, as well as the portrayal of women in the war. Despite some robust pushback from the EA devs, the character customization options were eventually dialed back ahead of release. There was also some criticism about the chosen theatres of war, with Battlefield 5 choosing to try and show off some of the untold stories from World War II, rather than reusing battles that had been used in many other games, such as Omaha Beach or the Battle at Stalingrad. The football metaphor can be further expanded upon because in the early goings of its life following release, Battlefield 5 was extremely slow out of the gates. It was buggy, there were performance issues and many game balancing issues that desperately needed addressing. But in the second half of the contest, Battlefield would come out of the dressing room with renewed vigour and would end things in a really good way. The movement was fantastic, the gunplay was amazing, and despite the lack of familiar maps and battles from World War II, many of the maps were great fun to play. Their final swing for the fence was with the War in Pacific DLC, and the response was incredible. It reinvigorated life back into the game as it allowed us to jump into some reimagined versions of classic Battlefield maps such as Iwo Jima, Pacific Storm, and Wake Island. The optimism at this point was huge, but despite this excitement for the future of the game, EA would shortly bring support to an end and shift focus to their next project. Battlefield 5 also had another story tied to it though, one of missed opportunities and overall a general wasted effort. I am of course talking about Battlefield 5 Firestorm. Now Firestorm, for those of you who do not know, was Battlefield 5's Battle Royale mode that was designed by Criterion in a clear attempt to cash in on the BR craze at the time. Released around 7 months after Call of Duty's first attempt Blackout, this was, on paper at least, the first time that the two Goliaths of FPS gaming would go head to head in the same space. The excitement was palpable. A Battle Royale in World War II with the scale that Battlefield could offer? Sign me up! It retained the destruction, the look and feel of the main game, and graphically it was stunning. With Battle Royales being all about large maps, lots of interesting POIs for the 100 players to explore, as well as fun and engaging gunfights that would break out during the match, you would imagine this format would lend itself extremely well to a Battlefield game. What resulted though was a hugely disappointing experience which ended up only receiving one update of significance before the plug was pulled and the game was left to its fate. Despite it being fun in many aspects, there were simply too many flaws to overlook, and clearly EA and Criterion didn't see enough interest to commit the manpower so that all those issues could be rectified. So why was it canned? Well, being locked behind a paywall of having to buy Battlefield 5 was definitely a contributing factor, but Blackout was also only available as part of a full COD purchase. But COD had a player base that dwarfed that of Battlefield 5. We all know about the constant fight to keep players' attention from games like Apex Legends, Fortnite and Warzone, where they're constantly having to update their games with new and sometimes strange content to keep players interested. So the lack of player base to begin with was always going to mean that Battlefield 5 was facing an uphill battle. Why didn't they go free to play? Why was there only one update? These are questions that we are highly unlikely ever to hear the answers to. They missed the mark badly, and given the success we have seen from Warzone and the others, I wouldn't mind betting that they are silently kicking themselves behind the scenes. Now, speaking of regrets, let's move on to the present day and talk about Battlefield 2042. Don't worry, I'll try and keep this brief. We were promised a love letter to the series, a throwback to what made the game amazing in previous iterations. What we ended up with though was anything but. Even as early as the alpha and beta tests, the warning signs were there, and even though it may have recovered somewhat now, in the early stages this game was an absolute disaster for EA and fans of the series. Their first massive error, in my view, was the decision to move away from the class system. Something that had been a mainstay throughout the entirety of the franchise's history was completely gone. What we got in its place was a series of generic specialists with cringy voice lines that all possessed various abilities that could be deployed on the battlefield.
Time to cause some trouble, am I right?
We had huge, soulless and lifeless maps with a colour palette throughout the game that left me cold. It was awful and horrid to look at and just added to the overall negativity of the game. The gunplay was extremely hit and miss, and the decision to switch to 128 players with huge maps was something that was hotly debated when it was first announced. The maps were too big, with huge and uninteresting open spaces between control points. Players shortly after demanded the introduction of 64 players and smaller maps, which did eventually come to the game initially as a timed mode before being implemented on a permanent basis. If there was ever an advertisement to show that bigger is not always better, then look no further than this game. Was everything horrible? No, it wasn't. The hot swapping of attachments was kind of cool, even if it was a bit gimmicky, and the portal mode allowed for some really cool and fun creations, including some throwback modes to previous Battlefield games. But this entire game felt like, for the first time, EA and Battlefield had fallen into the trap of trying to copy elements of other games and incorporate it into their own live service game. It was almost like they had an identity crisis, like Battlefield was feeling insecure with its place in the market, looking at other games with envious eyes and deciding that it needed to try and be something different. The problem is, Battlefield fans are expecting a Battlefield game. Classes, teamwork, large-scale, crazy only in Battlefield moments, whereas fans of the games that contain abilities, quirky characters, will largely want games that are faster paced, more intense fights, smaller maps, and less downtime between engagements. By choosing to try and do both, they ended up pleasing nobody. This horrid middle ground that they landed in set them on a path not towards a live service game that would happily please gamers and investors alike, but instead to a long, arduous and undeterminable journey towards salvation and recovery. Now though, they do at least know what happens when you get it wrong. What happens when you deviate from the formula that your own player base has loved for 20 odd years, and what happens when you make promises that you don't keep. Now, looking ahead to the next Battlefield project, we've already had snippets of information drop in the form of some concept art and some released comments from investor calls. The big news for me so far is that they are going back to a class system, ditching the very unlikable specialists, and they're also going back to a modern day setting and employing a back to basics approach with only 64 players available at launch. Now, worryingly, EA CEO said that it is one of their most ambitious projects in EA's history. Now, this sounds eerily similar to the sort of spiel that we got ahead of 2042. Of course, who knows what he means by ambitious? This could easily just be sales talk to investors to keep them feeling positive about things so that they don't get nervous. But equally, it does set us all up for raising expectations once again, and look what happened with 2042 last time they did that. There is also talk of an unannounced game mode coming to Battlefield, which rumours suggest is indeed a second attempt at making a battle royale. Specifically, a standalone battle royale like Warzone, which would also suggest that it will be free to play, unlike Battlefield 5's Firestorm. But with that genre arguably suffering from some serious gamer fatigue, could it instead be a second attempt at making an extraction shooter? Of course, for those that remember, the previous attempt that came with 2042 called Hazard Zone was absolutely woeful and was killed off quicker than Firestorm was. If the rumours are indeed true, then doing a battle royale and going up against Warzone is a big ask at a time where really battle royales are pretty much dead outside of the big three of Fortnite, Apex and Warzone. I personally think that there is still a good chance it will be more of an extraction type mode than a BR, possibly similar to that which exists in the recently released Delta Force game, or perhaps DMZ in Call of Duty. The question is, how do they do it better or different from Delta Force and COD? Or, if it is indeed a BR, how do they do it better than Warzone, Apex or Fortnite to ensure that they have a steady player base going forward? And finally, on a personal level, I wonder whether there will be a single player campaign. I do hope there is one where they could tell a proper narrative and give us some characters to bond with, like the quirky cohorts of Bad Company for example. Only time will tell with all of this, and I can only hope that EA and Battlefield truly understand the size of the task that lays ahead of them. So as an avid Battlefield fan, here is my take on what you need to do. Whatever modes the game may or may not come with, you have to immerse us, and you have to make us feel connected to this game. Give us a theatre of war that is full of atmosphere and character. Give us a game that forces collaboration like Battlefields of the past. Give us back the destruction that made these games so brilliant in the past, and focus on the core concepts of the previous entries and ignore what other games are doing. So here is hoping that the next Battlefield game brings back the glory days. I am excited to find out more about this entry, but until then, I am still having an absolute blast playing the previous entries. So there we have it, a walk down memory lane, an evaluation of today's state of play, and a look ahead to what might be on its way. So now, as we come to the end of this video, I would love it if you guys would tell me your memories of growing up with Battlefield. What are your favourite entries, and what are your hopes and aspirations for the new entry next year? Let me know your thoughts on these things or anything else. I really appreciate you guys all listening to me give my thoughts on one of my favourite franchises of all time, and all that is left for me to say is to ensure that you like the video, sub to the channel and ring the notification bell, and I will see you all on the next one.